We all know Henry VIII, the 6 wives, the split from Rome, the guy who basically said, "To hell with the Pope, I'll start my own church." But what most people don't know is how this iron-fisted monarch, arguably the most feared man in England, spent his final hours not in glory, but in rot. Literally. This isn't the death of a king surrounded by loyal subjects, whispering final wisdom with a tear in his eye. This is the story of a man so bloated he had to be lifted by pulleys, so paranoid no one dared say he was dying, and so consumed by fear that he tried to command death itself from his sickbed. And the twist? His death was just the beginning. What happened after his last breath would reshape England more violently than most of his wars ever did. The fight for his legacy turned brother against brother, daughter against daughter, and almost destroyed the very throne he built. Stick around, because one detail from his funeral will haunt you. It's hard to imagine the most powerful man in England, head of state, head of church, breaker of Rome itself, dying in his own filth, paranoid, immobile, and ignored. But that's exactly how King Henry VIII spent his final hours. And it wasn't noble. It wasn't dignified. It was a grotesque unraveling of a man who once reshaped an entire continent through sheer force of will, and who now couldn't even reshape the bedsheets beneath him. By the time January 1547 rolled around, Henry's health wasn't just failing, it had completely collapsed. The once towering athletic monarch, the guy who jousted in golden armor and had a thigh gap sharper than his sword, was now so bloated he reportedly had to be hoisted with mechanical pulleys just to get out of bed. His waistline had ballooned past 54 inches. That's not a royal robe, it's a tent. But weight was just the beginning. His legs were ulcerated, his breath reeked of rot, and he suffered from migraines, fevers, and a festering wound on his thigh that never properly healed after a jousting accident in 1536. In fact, many historians believe that injury marked the true turning point. Before that, Henry had been vigorous, even charming. After, he was short-tempered, erratic, and increasingly cruel. This was no coincidence. That leg wound left him largely sedentary, probably triggered chronic infections, and may have caused blood clots or even impacted his mental stability. Imagine having a pus-dripping hole in your leg for over a decade, and you're still trying to run an empire? Doctors of the time didn't help. Medical science in Tudor England leaned heavily on guesswork and bad smells. The king's physicians attempted everything from bleeding to poultices of herbs and animal dung. Some accounts suggest they even applied gold leaf to his ulcers, believing the precious metal could purify his rotting flesh. Spoiler, it didn't. And here's the kicker. No one could tell the king he was dying, not even when he clearly was. According to Tudor etiquette, to suggest a monarch was close to death was treasonous. So even as his body swelled with fluid, even as his skin turned a sickly gray and his speech slurred, no one dared utter the words. Not even Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who was summoned to his deathbed at Whitehall Palace. When Henry finally asked, "Do you think I die?" Cranmer, visibly shaken, simply held his hand and nodded. But rewind a few hours and the drama intensifies. On January 27th, Henry was barely conscious. His attendants had propped him up and tried to sponge clean the constant discharge from his legs, but the smell was unbearable. He was feverish, confused, and at times unable to recognize those around him. According to reports, the room was kept dim, likely to hide the full horror of his appearance. His once handsome face, immortalized in Holbein's majestic portraits, was now puffy and pallid. His speech was thick, his words garbled. Modern doctors reviewing the records have suggested everything from type 2 diabetes to Cushing's syndrome, and most agree he was likely suffering from chronic heart failure and kidney disease. Some even argue syphilis, though there's little concrete evidence of that. Whatever the precise diagnosis, one thing's for sure, his body was shutting down, organs collapsing like dominoes. And still, he was king. Even in his final hours, Henry clung to control. He'd spent the last years of his life micromanaging his legacy, issuing obsessive decrees about succession, demanding loyalty oaths from nobles, and rewriting his will multiple times. He was terrified. Not just of death, but of betrayal. His court was a viper's nest of factions, all jostling for power the moment his breath stopped. That paranoia wasn't unfounded. The minute he was gone, the scramble for influence over his 9-year-old heir, Edward VI, would become a full-blown power grab. Which brings us to the first twist. Henry's will, finalized just weeks before his death, left out one critical detail. It didn't name an official regent for the new boy king. Instead, it created a council of executors to share power. But within days of Henry's death, Edward Seymour, Henry's brother-in-law, had strong-armed the others into naming him Lord Protector. Just like that, the Tudor balance of power shifted. The king was dead, and a new regime was born before his corpse was even cold. But none of that mattered to Henry in those last hours. He wasn't thinking about parliament or politics. He was thinking about pain, about legacy, about whether God would forgive him for the 6 wives, the decapitations, the monasteries he'd looted. He ordered last rites, but they came late. Cranmer arrived when Henry could no longer speak. The only comfort the king could offer was to squeeze the archbishop's hand as a sign of his faith. Some claim it was a weak twitch. Others believe it was deliberate. Compare that to today. Imagine a sitting president or prime minister slipping away while everyone in the room pretends they're just taking a nap. No palliative care, no morphine, no farewell address to the nation, just silence, stink, and superstition. We sanitize death now. In Tudor England, they barely acknowledged it. And still, there was one more indignity to come. Henry's body, by some accounts, began to burst during transport days after his death. The procession to Windsor took time, and winter wasn't as cold as expected. One tale, likely exaggerated but still chilling, claims that dogs were seen licking a trail of bodily fluid that leaked from the coffin. Real or not, it's a grotesque reminder. Power doesn't make you immortal, it just buys you a bigger tomb. Next, we'll dig into the machinations swirling around Henry's deathbed. The secrets whispered in the shadows, the alliances formed before his heart even stopped, and the people already planning to rewrite his story before his final breath. While Henry lay gasping for air, struggling against his own collapsing body, the court outside his chamber buzzed like a hive ready to swarm. No one was officially told he was dying, but everyone knew, and that knowledge became currency. Those closest to the king began positioning themselves for the coming vacuum, whispering in corners, forging late-night alliances, and plotting to ride the coming storm into power. Edward Seymour was the quiet storm. Brother to Jane Seymour, Henry's third and favorite queen, Edward had been playing a long game. He knew that the 9-year-old Prince Edward was about to become king, and with Henry barely hanging on to life, Seymour wasn't going to wait politely for a formal invitation. He started consolidating his faction, gathering support among key nobles, and ensuring that the moment Henry's breath left his body, he would be ready to step in, not just as guardian of the new king, but as the man really running England. Seymour wasn't alone. There was also John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, another sharp political operator with eyes on the prize. The Privy Council was theoretically designed to balance power after Henry's death, but in practice, everyone knew that only one man would emerge as top dog. So while the king's final days dragged on behind closed doors, the real battle was already unfolding in velvet-draped rooms and candlelit hallways. What's wild is how little the public knew. There was no official statement, no court bulletin, no whisper of vulnerability. Even as Henry's health crumbled visibly, unable to walk, barely able to speak, his image was maintained through an elaborate theater of strength. Meals were still announced as if he might attend. Guards posted ceremoniously. Ministers came and went with deferential bows. The farce had to be preserved because the idea of a weak king was dangerous. England had foreign enemies watching. France and the Holy Roman Empire, both of whom had been humiliated by Henry in one way or another, would love nothing more than to pounce the second they sensed instability. But the king's decline was impossible to hide from everyone. Inside the royal apartments, the atmosphere turned thick with fear and calculation. Catherine Parr, Henry's 6th and final wife, did what she could, reading scriptures aloud, offering prayers, trying to keep the household from falling apart. But her position was precarious. Though she had survived the fate of her predecessors, she wasn't untouchable. Henry's paranoia had even targeted her once, accusing her of heresy before suddenly changing his mind. She'd narrowly avoided arrest. Now, watching him die, she must have known her time at the center of power was ending too. Then there was Henry's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, who had died in 1536. Some believed that if Fitzroy had lived, he might have inherited the throne, especially given Henry's obsession with securing a male heir. Instead, the burden fell entirely on little Edward, and everyone knew a child king would mean chaos. The Wars of the Roses were still a raw memory. The idea of another succession crisis terrified the court. That fear drove everything in those final hours. The religious stakes were equally fraught. Henry had broken from Rome, yes, but he'd never fully embraced Protestantism. His beliefs were a strange, personal cocktail of Catholic ritual and royal supremacy. He dissolved monasteries but kept many of the old rites. He allowed English Bibles, but executed those who took reform too far. So what direction would England take now? That depended entirely on who seized the reins. Reformers like Cranmer and Seymour hoped to push the nation further toward Protestantism. Conservatives wanted to drag it back to Catholic orthodoxy. Henry's corpse wasn't even cold, and the theological tug-of-war had already begun. Meanwhile, the inner sanctum of Whitehall grew quieter. The king slipped in and out of consciousness, muttering nonsense or lying still for hours. The only constant was the stench. His festering leg, once treated with poultices and syrups, had become a necrotic mess. They wrapped it tight to prevent seepage, but the smell was overwhelming. Attendants tried to keep windows open even in winter. They whispered among themselves, sometimes fleeing the room just to catch a breath. Compare that to a modern hospital ICU. Machines whirring, nurses on call, monitors tracking every heartbeat. In 1547, the King of England died surrounded not by science, but by silence, incense, and courtly fear. No pain relief, no sanitation, no bedside compassion team. Just a rotting body in a gilded bed, and a court afraid to admit the obvious. And yet, even as he neared death, Henry's mind remained fixated on control. He summoned his lawyers and scribes, making adjustments to his will. He insisted on receiving reports from his council. There are accounts of him dictating letters, issuing orders, though it's unclear how coherent these really were. Perhaps it was reflex. A lifetime of command doesn't switch off overnight, even when the brain is fogged with fever. One of the darkest indicators of the court's duplicity came just hours before his death. No one dared perform last rites until Henry himself requested it, because doing so without his explicit consent could have been interpreted as declaring him dead before he was. That was not only disrespectful, it was potentially treasonous. So Cranmer, who knew exactly what was happening, waited until the king himself whispered the request. Even then he delayed, nervous that the timing might cost him his head if Henry rallied. He didn't rally. When the end finally came, it was quiet. Henry could no longer speak. Cranmer asked him to squeeze his hand if he died a Christian. The king's fingers twitched faintly. That was the last recorded movement. No final speech. No grand goodbye. Just a weak grip in a darkened room. News of his death was withheld for days. The court kept up the illusion that the king was still alive, buying time for Seymour and his allies to cement control. Documents were backdated. Orders issued in the king's name were processed as if he'd signed them personally. It was a bizarre charade, but it worked. By the time the death was announced, the machinery of succession was already in motion. But outside Whitehall, England was unprepared. The country had no idea the king was even ill. When the announcement finally came, it was met with shock and confusion. People mourned, certainly, but they also wondered what kind of king Edward would be. Could a 9-year-old really hold the kingdom together? And what would happen to all the laws Henry had passed? The religious reforms, the executions, the endless policies crafted from his whims? The real answer was this. It didn't matter. Henry's death didn't end his influence. It began a whole new era of people fighting to claim his legacy, warp his memory, and use his authority to justify their agendas. Next, we'll follow the aftermath, the wild scramble for power, the political betrayals, and the secretive maneuvers made in Henry's name as his embalmed body made its way to Windsor. The king was dead, but the battle over his ghost was just getting started. The coffin was sealed, but the game was wide open. As Henry's bloated body began its slow, symbolic journey toward St. George's Chapel in Windsor, the machinery of ambition kicked into high gear. The man who had reigned for 38 years left behind not just a child monarch, but a power vacuum so intense it threatened to tear the court apart. And no one knew that better than the men already circling like vultures. Edward Seymour moved fast. Before the announcement of the king's death was even public, he'd locked in support from key council members. By offering titles, bribes, and the tantalizing promise of influence over the boy king Edward VI, he turned the so-called Council of Executors into a rubber stamp. Within days, he wasn't just a powerful uncle. He was named Lord Protector of the Realm, essentially ruling England in the name of the child monarch. Henry had envisioned a balanced regency council to prevent exactly this kind of power grab. Seymour made sure that vision died along with the king. Others weren't so quick to roll over. Thomas Wriothesley, the ambitious Lord Chancellor, had imagined himself as a guiding hand during the regency, but Seymour stripped him of his title within weeks, accusing him of overreach and mismanagement. John Dudley watched all this carefully. He didn't strike immediately. He waited, calculated, played the loyal servant. But his patience would pay off in ways even Seymour couldn't anticipate. And then there was Princess Mary, Henry's eldest daughter. Though technically back in the line of succession after years of being branded illegitimate, she was still treated with suspicion. A staunch Catholic, she represented everything the reformers feared, and she knew it. With her father gone and her half-brother too young to protect her, Mary began quietly strengthening her own circle of supporters, writing letters to the Holy Roman Emperor and watching the regency with wary eyes. The funeral procession itself was a mix of grim tradition and raw political theater. Nobles lined up in carefully ranked order, each aware that their placement could signify their current standing with the new regime. Henry's coffin, allegedly leaking due to the poor state of embalming, was draped in cloth of gold and carried on a grand chariot. But the pageantry couldn't hide the unease. Everyone there understood. This was more than a funeral. It was a moment of reckoning, a transition from one of the most domineering rulers in English history to a child. That contrast alone was jarring. Henry had ruled with an iron fist, executing wives, nobles, monks, and anyone who dared challenge him. He'd reshaped England's religion, redrawn its laws, and terrorized its nobility into submission. Now, that throne would be occupied by a boy whose feet barely reached the floor. The real question wasn't who would guide Edward. It was who would use him. Compare this to today's political transitions, which, while often tense, are governed by constitutions and checks. Back then, legitimacy was forged in backrooms and backed by blades. There were no elections, no term limits, just raw ambition and whatever power you could seize before someone else did. Meanwhile, Catherine Parr found herself swiftly pushed aside. Though she'd survived the court's deadly politics for years, outliving 5 other queens, she wasn't a power player anymore. Within months, she married Thomas Seymour, Edward's other uncle and Edward Seymour's brother. That decision, made hastily and without council approval, raised eyebrows across court. It also sparked a bitter rivalry between the Seymour brothers, one that would boil over in a few short years. As for the people of England, their mourning was real but confused. Henry had ruled so long that many couldn't remember life before him. He had been feared, yes, but also respected, even admired. He had stood up to the Pope, restructured the church, and made England richer by looting Catholic institutions. But he'd also bankrupted the treasury, destroyed communities, and left religious chaos in his wake. To the common folk, his death was a strange moment, like waking up and discovering the storm had passed, only to realize no one knew what came next. Inside the court, paranoia simmered. Men who had survived Henry's wrath were now haunted by the question: would the new regime forgive or finish what Henry had started? Spies circulated through noble households. Allegiances were tested. Some who had been exiled during Henry's reign began cautiously returning to England, hoping the new leadership might be more lenient, or at least distracted enough not to notice them slipping back in. The young Edward VI, barely old enough to grasp what was happening, was placed under heavy guard and strict tutelage. His days were filled with religious instruction, language lessons, and political grooming. He was taught to view himself as a Protestant prince, chosen by God to continue the Reformation. But behind the lessons was a prison of expectation. Every word he spoke, every document he signed, was filtered through adult ambitions. He was king in name only. In practice, he was a pawn. And so, even as Henry's body was lowered into the crypt at Windsor, his shadow loomed over every decision. No one dared stray too far from what could be interpreted as the king's will, not because of law, but because his ghost still terrified them. That's the strange paradox of his death. Even gone, he was too dangerous to ignore. Then came the documents. In the weeks after his burial, Henry's clerks began releasing a final flurry of orders and decrees, some real, some fabricated. These included land grants, titles, and policy shifts designed to favor whoever had the foresight to pay the right bribes or curry favor with the new council. The line between Henry's last legitimate wishes and opportunistic forgeries blurred fast. It became common knowledge that documents could be backdated or discovered conveniently posthumously. Truth was negotiable. Power was not. Among the more surreal consequences of this chaos was the reactivation of old enemies. Reginald Pole, once branded a traitor and hunted by Henry's assassins, was now being whispered about again. The Catholic countercurrents were surging quietly across Europe. With Henry gone, many believed a return to Rome might be possible, especially if Mary somehow ascended the throne. Protestant reformers doubled down, determined to make sure Henry's religious legacy, however muddled, didn't backslide. Back in Windsor, the chapel doors were sealed. Inside lay the bloated king, interred beside Jane Seymour, the only wife he chose to be buried with. The symbolism was deliberate. She had given him a son. The others were forgotten, discarded, or disgraced. Even in death, Henry curated his legacy, crafting a myth in marble and Latin inscriptions. But legacy isn't something you control from the grave. It's something others fight over. And the fight had only just begun. Next, we dive into the unraveling of Henry's carefully built facade, how the Regency began to fracture, how Edward Seymour's grip slipped, and how the myth of Henry the Great began to be questioned by those forced to live in the kingdom he'd left behind. The king was buried, but his legend was about to be exhumed. Henry VIII's tomb was sealed, but the struggle for control was just heating up. Less than a year into the Regency, cracks had already started to show. Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, had gone from the man behind the throne to the man everyone wanted out of the room. His power grabs, his unilateral decisions, and his failure to stabilize England were alienating even his closest allies. And in a court full of ambitious men with long memories and sharp knives, that was a death sentence. Somerset had overestimated his leverage. Yes, he had control of young King Edward VI, but he underestimated just how volatile the situation was. The English economy was in freefall. Enclosure riots, peasant rebellions against landlords fencing off common land, were exploding across the countryside. Inflation soared. Grain prices doubled. The coinage had been debased under Henry's late reign, and the effects were now biting hard. Ordinary people were starving while the nobles hoarded wealth. The myth of a strong, unified Tudor state was collapsing fast. Somerset's attempts to push Protestant reform didn't help either. Churches were stripped of images. Latin was removed from services. Even the Mass was attacked. These changes pleased the radicals but enraged traditionalists. Mary, Henry's Catholic daughter, became a lightning rod for opposition. People whispered that the true faith had died with Henry, and that only Mary could restore it. What made matters worse was that Edward Seymour wasn't a tactful operator. He didn't build coalitions. He bulldozed. He alienated fellow council members by acting unilaterally, issuing proclamations in the king's name without consent, and undermining traditional authority structures. He governed like Henry, but without Henry's presence, charisma, or political cunning. Worst of all, he ignored his most dangerous rival, John Dudley. Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, played a long game. He sat quietly on the council, agreeing when it suited him, feigning concern when it didn't. He watched Somerset burn bridges and waited for the right moment to act. When the Prayer Book Rebellion erupted in 1549, an open revolt against the new Protestant liturgy, Somerset panicked. He ordered harsh crackdowns, which only fueled public hatred. His response to unrest in Norfolk, where thousands of rebels rallied under Robert Kett, was equally disastrous. Dudley, seeing the opportunity, stepped in. He raised an army, crushed the rebellion, and returned to court as a hero. The contrast was stark. Somerset looked like a flailing bureaucrat. Dudley looked like a savior. Within weeks, the council turned. A coup was staged, quiet and bloodless. Somerset was arrested, stripped of power, and eventually imprisoned in the Tower. Dudley took control, though he was careful not to call himself Lord Protector. Instead, he styled himself President of the Council, a title less threatening, but no less powerful. This shift sent shockwaves through England. The boy king remained a silent figurehead, but his signature now backed Dudley's will. Religious reform accelerated. Catholic bishops were replaced, traditional holidays suppressed, and radical Protestant thinkers invited into court circles. Henry's middle path church, his compromise between Rome and reform, was being gutted in real time. And yet, Henry's ghost lingered. Many still clung to the idea that the old king had intended a more moderate course. His final religious settlement, enshrined in the 6 Articles, had been conservative. His last speeches suggested a desire for stability, not revolution. But now his successors were dragging the country toward extremes, first one way, then the other. Even young Edward VI, growing more confident with age, began to reject his father's policies. He referred to Henry's compromises with disdain, calling them weak or corrupt. He embraced reform zealously, pushing for deeper Protestant changes in everything from vestments to church property. It was ironic. Henry had spent years destroying Catholic monasteries to enrich the crown, all while insisting he remained a true believer. Edward wanted to go further, spiritually and structurally. His regime sold off what was left of church land, passed new doctrinal laws, and printed increasingly radical prayer books. Meanwhile, the public watched with confusion and fear. The old Catholic festivals were banned. Church walls were scrubbed clean. Latin chants gave way to English sermons that condemned popish idolatry. In rural areas, this was less reform than cultural annihilation. Whole communities had built their lives around saints' days, local processions, and veneration rituals. Now they were being told these were not just outdated, but sinful. It felt less like salvation and more like erasure. Against this backdrop, rebellions continued to brew. In Cornwall and Devon, in Norfolk and Yorkshire, people took up arms, not just over religion, but over hunger, land, and law. The king's government responded with force. Executions were public and brutal. Bodies were hung from trees as warnings. But repression didn't heal the wounds. It deepened them. Inside court, Dudley was riding high. He was showered with titles, finally becoming Duke of Northumberland. But success bred arrogance. He believed he could shape the future entirely in his image, and that included controlling the line of succession. Edward, increasingly sickly, was clearly not going to live long. By 1553, the teenaged king began wasting away from what modern historians believe was tuberculosis. Dudley, desperate to preserve Protestant control, convinced the dying boy to rewrite the succession. Henry's will had reinstated both Mary and Elizabeth in the line of succession, despite their earlier illegitimacy. But Dudley had other ideas. He proposed skipping both daughters in favor of Lady Jane Grey, Henry's great-niece and, conveniently, Dudley's daughter-in-law. Jane was young, Protestant, and pliable, a perfect puppet. Edward agreed. On his deathbed, he signed a new document, the Devise for the Succession. Mary and Elizabeth were out. Jane was in. The move was bold. It was also illegal. When Edward died in July 1553, Dudley sprang into action. Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. But the people didn't cheer. In London and across the country, crowds remained silent. Loyalty to Henry's line still ran deep, and Mary, though Catholic, was the rightful heir in many eyes. Within 9 days, Mary raised an army, marched to London, and reclaimed the throne. Dudley was arrested. Jane was imprisoned. The coup had failed. It was a spectacular collapse, and a final unraveling of everything Henry had tried to orchestrate. His religious compromise was gone. His Council of Balance had mutated into dictatorship. His son had died young. His chosen heir had been cast aside. And now his Catholic daughter was queen of a Protestant country. In the end, Henry's obsession with control created only chaos. He had micromanaged everything. His marriages, his children, his church, his ministers. But he never trusted anyone enough to build true continuity. His legacy, far from being a solid foundation, was a time bomb, and the explosion had finally come. Next, we'll watch that legacy burn in real time, through the reign of Mary VIII, the persecution of Protestants, and the myth-making that followed. Henry had wanted to be remembered as England's greatest king. Instead, he left a nation confused, divided, and teetering on the edge of another violent transformation. One final act remained before his legacy could be sealed forever. The Tudor flame had dimmed, but it wasn't out. Mary's eyes' rise to the throne was swift, shocking, and for a brief moment, hopeful. Crowds gathered in London not to riot, but to cheer. Here was the true heir, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the first queen, and the woman who had never wavered in her Catholic faith. To many, especially in rural England, her coronation felt like a homecoming. The Protestant whirlwind that had overturned their altars and silenced their saints was about to be reversed. At last, the chaos unleashed by her father's compromises could be repaired. But the repair was brutal. Mary, determined to restore Catholicism, believed that healing England meant purging heresy. What followed was a campaign of persecution that would stain her legacy forever. Over 280 Protestants were burned at the stake in less than 5 years. Bishops, scholars, commoners, none were spared if they refused to recant. The flames licked the streets of Smithfield, Oxford, and Canterbury. Children watched parents die. Families fled to the continent. And while Mary believed she was saving souls, what she really ignited was a backlash that would outlive her by centuries. And all of it was done in the name of undoing her father's work. Henry VIII had shattered Rome's hold, seized monastic lands, and created a hybrid church that centered royal power. Mary tried to rewind that clock. She reconnected England to the Pope, reinstated old rights, and persecuted those who stood in the way. But what she didn't understand, or perhaps refused to see, was that Henry's break from Rome had changed more than doctrine. It had changed identity. A generation had grown up under Henry's Church of England. They spoke prayers in English. They read Bibles without Latin. Their parish priests married, their services were simpler, and their religious life was increasingly personal. Mary's effort to reinstate Catholicism felt to many like not just a return to faith, but a return to fear. Even worse, her marriage to Philip of Spain stoked national resentment. Henry had always played European powers against each other to England's advantage. Mary aligned herself directly with Spain, a foreign king, a Catholic powerhouse, and a deeply unpopular consort. Philip spoke little English and spent as little time in the country as possible. His presence was a symbol not of unity, but subjugation. Rebellions followed. The most serious, Wyatt's rebellion in 1554, nearly toppled her government. Though it failed, it exposed just how fragile her hold on the crown truly was, and it forced her hand in executing Lady Jane Grey, the so-called 9 Days Queen. Jane, just 17, had become a Protestant martyr. Her death, and the manner of it, shocked the nation. She was young, innocent, and never wanted the throne. Mary killed her anyway, believing it necessary for stability. Instead, it cemented a sense that her reign was not a restoration. It was retribution. And all the while, Henry's shadow loomed. Mary invoked her father's authority constantly. She claimed that he had always remained Catholic at heart, that his break with Rome was political, not spiritual, that he would have supported her mission to restore the true faith, but the country wasn't buying it. Henry's church may have been muddled, but it was his. Mary's felt foreign, harsh, vengeful. Her reign ended as tragically as it began. After a series of phantom pregnancies, she died childless in 1558, her body weakened by illness, and her spirit shattered by failure. She had tried to reverse history. Instead, she accelerated its course. Enter Elizabeth, Henry's second daughter, declared illegitimate after her mother, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded, now took the throne. Unlike her sister, Elizabeth had no illusions about restoring the past. She embraced Protestantism, but carefully. She re-established the Church of England, but kept elements of tradition. She avoided marriage, avoided foreign entanglements, and above all, avoided fanaticism. And that's where Henry's real legacy began to take shape, not in his son, or his regents, or even in his own rule, but in the woman who inherited his kingdom and learned from his failures. Elizabeth watched her father rule through fear. She chose charisma. She watched her brother's regents swing the pendulum too far toward radicalism. She chose compromise. She watched her sister burn heretics and alienate allies. She chose diplomacy. Yet, even Elizabeth could never fully escape the contradictions he'd left behind. Her church was still a compromise. Her succession still fraught. Her court still full of spies, traitors, and religious tension. Henry's obsession with male heirs had erased centuries of precedent and forced 3 wildly different monarchs to reinvent legitimacy from scratch. His break from Rome had given England independence, but at the cost of unity. His cult of personality had made monarchy seem omnipotent, until his death proved otherwise. Modern parallels. Imagine if a head of state today rewrote the entire national constitution, changed the country's religion, declared themselves the moral authority of their people, then died without a clear plan for who should follow or how. The result would be chaos. In Henry's case, it was civil unrest, religious war, and a half-century of dynastic anxiety. But perhaps the strangest part of Henry's final hours is how little they ultimately meant to his legend. He died alone, in agony, afraid to confront the God he had manipulated for decades. His physicians were powerless. His ministers were already moving on. His body was decaying before his will had even been fully read. And yet, in portraits, in schoolbooks, in national memory, he remains the archetype of power, a man of appetites, decisions, and consequences. That legacy is not noble, it's not clean, but it's very, very real. England's journey from Catholicism to Protestantism, from monarchy to modernity, passed through Henry's twisted corridors of ambition, fear, and contradiction. His heirs reaped what he sowed, sometimes in fire, sometimes in blood, sometimes in silence. And whether they tried to restore him or erase him, none could escape him. Even today we can't. Every time we talk about royal authority, church-state conflict, or the power of personality in politics, Henry's shadow flickers in the background. Because for all the glory and ceremony, Henry VIII's last hours revealed the truth behind the throne, that even the mightiest kings are mortal, and even the most carefully laid plans can rot like flesh in a gilded coffin. So after all the bloodshed, the excommunications, the marriages and massacres, Henry VIII died not with a bang, but in a dark room, drowning in his own body's failure, ignored by a court too scared to speak. The man who made himself England's supreme head of church and state left behind a royal family so broken it barely survived the century. His children would tear each other apart trying to finish or undo what he started. His reforms became battlegrounds. His memory became myth. And his true legacy? A kingdom forever changed by one man's obsession with control, lineage, and eternal glory. But here's the question. Was Henry a genius who secured England's independence, or a tyrant who left chaos in his wake? Was the Reformation a bold step forward, or a national trauma we still don't fully understand? Tell us what you think. Was his death the start of modern England, or the moment it almost lost everything? And if you want more brutally honest deep dives into real medieval life, far beyond the myths, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got a lot more where this came from.